the Liberals have dumped net zero as a party in the last couple weeks, and many conservatives from the right side of the Liberals and the Nationals, they've been crying out for something like this for a very long time, while others wanted to keep the targets set by previous governments and the Paris agreements. How do we think about this as conservatives and as Christians? And you know what? The answer might surprise you, and that's today on the Rayne Orange Show. So again, the Liberals have dumped net zero, if you haven't heard, and this is really significant, not the least because there's a whole series of events that happened just after our federal election in May. Peter Dutton versus Anthony Albanese, and obviously after a loss like that, Peter Dutton couldn't stay the leader of the opposition. And now I know that a lot of people really didn't like Peter Dutton, but I actually didn't mind him. Now, he wasn't really willing to stand strong on a lot of the issues that we all really care about, like the trans issues and abortion, but I liked that Peter Dutton came across really controlled and level-headed. He was very measured and he seemed to know what he thought anyways. And that's just a real contrast to Albo, who I've always thought just looks like a little bit sneaky, like nothing about Labour's policy at all. I just think that Albanese is dramatically unlikable. He just has this look to him that's a bit weaselly and sneaky, and I don't find his manner charming in any way, and I'm actually just really surprised that he's the front man of the Labour government. And I found it particularly striking having someone like Dutton stand next to him who seems more strong and stoic. So anyways, not the point. I'm not like Dutton's number one fan who's just really sad that he's not the prime minister. That's not it at all. But there was this obvious question after the election of who would be the new leader. So I think a lot of us at home on the right, especially those of us who are more socially conservative, were really hoping that they would put in someone who's like going to stand really strong on principle, like a Jacinta Price or an Andrew Hastie or an Angus Taylor, people who haven't been like backwards about coming forwards about what it is that they think on a whole range of issues. People who seem to be more switched on about doing what is right than necessarily what will just get them the most votes. And this would have been a real change, right? And instead of the Liberals carrying on with a lot of the same, like Labour light that we've had, like at least since Malcolm Turnbull, I'd say. Yeah, so Turnbull was here when I got here. And while I feel like I probably wasn't really across what all the things were, like, I've always been interested in politics, but I wouldn't say I've been as interested as I am now. So I never got to see Tony Abbott in action, but I really like listening to him now. Again, he seems really measured, like he knows what he thinks, and I think that he's someone that is absolutely willing to put like what he thinks is right, which he might not always be right on. No one's 100% right, but he's willing to put that before like trying to make himself more attractive. And from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but his ousting seemed to be about the Liberal Party trying to go more moderate. And the Libs have just kept going in that direction. And I think like what they're trying to do is catch more fish with a wider net. But I'm just not sure that that's worked. And so if we think back to May, who's going to be the leader? And the vote was between Susan Ley from the moderate faction of the Liberal Party and Angus Taylor, who was the shadow treasurer under the National Right faction of the Liberal Party. And so there were some other people who were kind of invited to the challenge or nominated, whatever, including Andrew Hastie, and he declined. But I'm guessing that that was more of a timing thing because everyone in Canberra wants to be prime minister, right? And I think it's about figuring out when do you take your moment. So now, again, I want to fully admit that I'm not across all of the dealings with the parties and all of the individual ministers. I think we often hear about these like legislative moments when they're culturally significant, but there was a moment in myself when I realized that, I shouldn't say I wondered if the Liberals had made a mistake with Susan Ley. So I know nothing about her. I'm totally happy enough for like a woman to lead the party. I don't think that some of those conversations about male headship, like in the home and the church, translate outside of those contexts fine that she's a woman, that's not my shtick. But there was a moment I had and I thought, oh gosh. And that moment was, I was driving in my husband's car, probably going to the gym, and I was listening, and he often has the ABC radio on in the car because balance is good, and I agree, you want to listen to things that are probably generally different from your normal worldview. But anyway, so I was listening to the ABC, and they were talking about how the culture war issues weren't going to get the Liberals anywhere, and how Susan Ley was a good idea because she's moderate, in the moderate faction, she's a woman, like it's much more progressive than what the Liberals have done before. And as clearly, Labour's victory was because the Libs were just so far behind in their draconian worldview, Susan Ley was a good choice. But my thought was, if the left wing, their commentators, the ABC radio hosts, and Labour thinks you've picked a good candidate that probably looks more like them in a lot of ways, I think there's just a chance you've got the wrong candidate. And now, to be fair, like, this episode is actually going to be a bit about net zero and so I don't want to waste too much time talking about it, but I do think it's important to know who the leader of the opposition is. And at this point, 6 months ago in the car, listening to the coverage, I didn't really know that much about Susan Ley, but I just looked her up, and here's some points of her voting history and stuff so that we can see where she stands in the framework of the coalition and the moderate and the right and what those factions mean. So, buckle up. We have the same birthday, I found out, so that's actually a huge tick for Susan Ley. Being born on December 14th is wonderful. And so I was like, oh, we have the same birthday. But anyways, that actually doesn't matter. She identifies as a feminist, which in some ways it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? Is she a feminist that is just like, man, women are equal to men in value and in worth, and I think that everyone should be treated according to that worth. And so if that's the case, I'm a feminist. However, I've never identified as a feminist, and I don't feel oppressed as a woman. I almost never have. And so I sometimes think that is a label where it's a bit of a red flag for me. But anyways, she's also a Republican. So she's actually really keen to make Australia a republic and to separate from the monarchy of Britain. I don't have a formed opinion on this. I'm really open to all of the conversations, though I do think that generally, like, what the British Empire brought to the whole rest of the world, I think has done net good more than net harm. I am neither here nor there at this point of if we should be a republic or not, but she's a Republican, so I think it's worth knowing. Now, she voted for same-sex marriage in 2017. This is a big one. She backs the e-safety commissioner, which I find endlessly annoying because in my mind, it's like abortion is a voting issue and free speech is a voting issue. And after that, there's other things. But as far as kind of the social issues or things that really underpin society, like free speech is like number one. So the fact that she backs the e-safety commissioner, who has made some super questionable decisions, is like something. So she slammed the questions asked by Andrew Hastie and Alex Andick and Matt Canavan and Pauline Hanson and others about Baby Priya's bill just the other week. If you were following at home, this was a bill that gave women who, it secured their paid parental leave through private employment if they experienced a late-term stillbirth, which I think, again, no one was against the principle of the bill. Like, we want women to have that security, and for employers to take away promised paid parental leave in the case of a stillbirth, I think is quite cruel. But the thing that we were talking about and that these senators were bringing up was, well, if a woman has a late-term abortion, then do they still get that funding? And ultimately, everyone was up in arms about people even asking questions. Now, about 41% of stillbirths are due to abortion. And so there's a huge chunk, almost half, where we think employers will have no choice but to pay these women if they have a late-term abortion. It was a great thing to bring up and Labour and the Greens stifled debate on it, and it passed without amendment. So that's that. But anyways, Susan Ley slammed the questions asked about that. She voted in favor of the federal government to increase the availability of the abortion pill. So she's definitely pro-choice. Now, this one's really interesting, but in 2011, Ley supported the admission of the state of Palestine to the United Nations and was reported to be a member of the cross-party Parliamentary Friends of Palestine group. But this is super interesting. She visited Israel in 2022, and she said the trip changed her mind on the issue. Susan Ley criticized Fatima Payne and has publicly said that she would reverse Labour's recognition of Palestine if she won the next election. She supported no in the Voice referendum. And last but not least, not politically significant maybe, but she is a vegetarian, so do with that what you will. But anyways, back to net zero. So just after the election in May, the coalition actually temporarily split over some of the demands that the Nationals had coming back to these negotiations that they do, which included going forward with nuclear. That was one of their 4 non-negotiables. Now, after a week, the gang came back together, but there's clearly some internal conversations happening with all these things, with nuclear and what does net zero look like, and how do we move forward with the power prices and energy policy and all of these things. So Morrison, who is obviously the last Liberal Prime Minister, he agreed to some of these targets by net zero by 2050, and now they have repealed that and have said that they're not going to have any stated timeframe goal. And so it is actually a really big deal, because if you've been alive, then you know that for the last 15 years, there's been this climate emergency that has just like totally taken over everything. And I feel like a climate denier is like the worst thing you could be called. And so we're going to read a little bit about what the ABC had to say in their reporting of the coalition dumping net zero. I just do think it's helpful to look across the board at different reporting. This is what they had to say. A meeting of Liberal shadow ministers on Thursday decided to repeal Labour's 2030 emissions reduction legislation, but determined to remain in the Paris Agreement and set 5 yearly interim targets, though only from government. The party said it would reduce emissions on average year on year in line with the comparable countries and as fast and as far as technologies allow without imposing mandated costs. And while the Liberals would not actively strive for net zero, it was agreed that reaching it would be a most welcome outcome. We remain committed to Paris, and we made it very clear that it isn't our policy to set long-term targets, but net zero would be a welcome outcome, again, said opposition leader Susan Ley. Shadow Energy Minister Dan Tehan, who has been tasked with steering the party's emission policy development, said that all natural resources, including coal, should be used to push down further energy prices, while ensuring that Australia does its fair share to reduce emissions. We want to be throwing all technology at emission reduction, he said. We will be the only party that is saying to the Australian people that when it comes to energy abundance, we will use all of our resources, and when it comes to reducing emissions, we will also use all of the available technology. One Liberal told the ABC that this was a compromise between the moderate and conservative factions. Another said it was more closely aligned with the right faction's preferred position. Anyways, so I think it's very interesting that the coalition have ditched net zero, but what I find more interesting is thinking about why they did that. And we're going to talk more about why they might have, as well as what do we think as Christians about these kinds of matters after a word from our sponsors. This podcast is brought to you by Kayan Media Australia, the team that actually understands attention and what makes people care. They're known across Australia for their high-impact video content, but they don't stop there. Kayan Media builds entire brand ecosystems, strategy, design, social media presence, full campaigns, everything that your message needs to cut through and actually land. Don't just post, influence. And for what it's worth, this wouldn't be possible without Kayan Media. You've probably noticed the increase in production quality, and that's because of the team at Kayan Media. They've been consulting with me all through this process of starting this podcast. And truly, if I didn't have their team to ask questions of, I think that this would be a lot worse for a lot longer. So I'm very thankful to Kayan Media. And our other sponsor is Little Bean Coffee. So Little Bean is Australia's first pro-life coffee company. 10% of all of the profits from Little Bean go directly to pregnancy support centers. These are the centers who are the hands and feet of Jesus. They are giving real help to women who are in pregnancy crisis situations all the time. They are providing nappies and cots and all the things you need to have a baby. They also are helping to fund ultrasounds. They'll send someone, a support person, with you to your appointment. They will even help with housing. They will give you parenting resources so that you are equipped to parent, even if maybe you didn't have a good example of parenting growing up. So every cup that you drink of Little Bean actually saves lives and equips women to be better moms. So if you go over to littlebean.au and use code RAINE10 at checkout, you can get 10% off your order or 20% if you couple that with a subscription. You can follow what Little Bean does on Instagram. They are at littlebean.au. So again, I think it's super interesting that the coalition have decided to ditch net zero and that they've decided to do it now. But what I find more interesting is thinking about, so why did they do it and why did they now? And so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of my background in terms of why I might think the way I do about energy policy. But I grew up in the oil fields of Canada where like F the environment was a thing that people would say. Like my family have made their money off of the oil field. My dad works in the oil field. My mom works in administration in the oil field. Like I grew up in a town that was oil and farming and that was it. And so there's heaps of industry if you're not working, on wells or on trucks or whatever, then you have a company that supplies parts or you have an electrician company that assists with things in the oil field. That's what it is. And so, I think, and that part of the country is also in Canada is very conservative generally. And that's how I grew up. And so I think I thought all the green stuff, I probably didn't actually hear much about like environmentally friendly. It was the only thing I think I can remember growing up was when fracking became a big deal and people were talking about the oil sands that were, in my home province, but like quite a bit further than where I was living. And there was some controversy there, or like the Keystone Pipeline, but I don't really remember like the green thing being a part of my like world growing up at all. And so when I moved to Australia at the age of 20, it was actually really different because I wasn't living somewhere rural for the first time in my life, living somewhere quite urban. And also everyone's like, the sun will kill you, which is like a little bit true. But then also they're like, there's this hole in the ozone. It's climate change. Like all of the greenhouse gases everywhere in the world all like rise to above Australia and they've burnt this hole in the ozone. And that's why the sun's so bad. And so I was like, oh my goodness, like no one's ever talked about this growing up. And so I think that there was a greater awareness for me of the different points of view than where I grew up. And I really grew to be more environmentally conscious. So I actually got pretty green. Like I was thinking about things like composting my food besides just the Fogo bins and trying to make the right choices, and having solar panels was like a goal of mine, like a life goal, because I was like, we have the sun here. Like, sure, they don't make any sense in the middle of the prairies in Canada where it's dark and cold for half the year, but like south coast of New South Wales, it makes a lot of sense. I'd still kind of like to get a Tesla, but I just think they have a bit of a cool factor as well. But there was this moment where I was like really environmentally conscious, and I was even putting my money where my mouth is, and we care about these things, right? But now I feel like I've come back to earth a bit. I have a bit more of a nuanced view of it all, and in my point of view, we all think that we have the most nuanced and right point of view. But I really feel like through the last 10 years, I've been able to listen to people on both sides, entertain both perspectives, and have matured in my understanding. And I think we really need to be talking about these things as Christians. So the first thing I want to do is I want to open up the Word of God. I'm going to go get my Bible, and we're going to look at a couple things together. So I want to take us first to Genesis 1. So in Genesis 1, we have the creation story, right? God made everything, he made the people, and then he gave Adam and Eve a mission. So we're going to read a few verses near the end of the chapter that are going to show us some of that mission. In verse 28 and 29 of Genesis 1, it says this: God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with a seed in it. They will be yours for food." So we can see here that and just the verse before this, right, is that man and women were made in the image of God. In our image, he created them. And so we see in these verses that God gave us the world. The earth gives us food. The earth is our home. And the earth is a part of revealing God's glory to us through the majesty of his creation, as we see in Romans 1. The mere scale of the world and some of the power that it holds in the ocean and the rain and all of that, it shows us that we're not God and that we need to respect what's around us, because there are some natural forces that are just so beyond human power that we can't even comprehend it, right? Think of the flooding, think of the power of the ocean, think of the power of fire. It's incredible. But that doesn't make the earth God, but it points us to a God that is greater than us and a God that is greater than the earth. We are told to subdue and rule the earth. But like I said, there's some things that just can't be subdued. But there's things that we can use to our benefit. I come from farming. I didn't farm. My mom grew up on a farm. The whole area I came from, heaps of farm kids in my class. But farming is toil. Never have I seen people work so hard as farmers who are up from dawn till midnight to try to seed or harvest. It is hard work. But we can whip the land into providing for us, and that's what we do, right? We can harness the powerful currents of the ocean and the riverways for power. We can use the wind to get these huge planes up in the air and travel around. We can build shelters, houses over fields to better protect us. We use the earth to help us flourish as humans. I want to be clear here that I don't think that the word subdue is at all exploitative. I don't think that we should be trying to milk the earth for all it's worth without thinking about what that means for the world and the environment and the animals. That's not what I think it means. But when you look up the word subdue, it means to overcome, to quieten, and to bring under control, right? I think that because God gave us this world and told us to use it for ourselves, that we have a responsibility to it, not only to honor it as our home, but to honor God. Because of this, like I said, I think we need to be considerate about how we treat the environment. And personally, I think we should be as thoughtful as we absolutely can and as responsible as we can. And some things for me, these are all little things, but I think it's about your heart, is I look for glass containers instead of plastic whenever possible at the supermarket. Passata, I buy it in the glass. Things like that, because I know that glass is much easier to recycle, and also microplastics. But when we have clothes that are too tattered or too stained to donate for charity or to resell, we don't just put them in the bin. We make sure that we take the time to take them to where they can recycle them. You can take them to H&M. Any H&M, they take any textiles in any condition and they use them for different things. My family and I work really hard to live within our means and to not just buy into consumerism where we just have so much stuff that as soon as we don't want it anymore, it goes to landfill or breaks. We don't want to be those people as much as possible. Our kids know that littering is morally repugnant, right? We don't want to just put our trash everywhere. We care about our garden and planting. And again, these are little things, but I think that they reflect an attitude that we should want to care for the environment that we're in. But I think that is the question here, right? The question that the coalition has raised by ditching net zero is, what is the cost and what should we be doing to care about the earth? I mean, it's absolutely clear that we're in a cost of living crisis. We aren't the people that skimp on food because we're pretty stingy anyways, and we want to eat well and we want to eat healthy. But I cannot believe how much money we spend on food. And I know we've got growing kids, but it's changed. We spend so much money on food. And if my husband didn't have a stable job, I don't know what we would do. Like, it would be really tough. And we're already not extravagant people. It's not like we have all of this money in savings. Like, you know, all I want in the world is a bathtub, and we don't have money to do the bathrooms right now. Like, one day we will, and it will be awesome. But it's like, you know, you've got to save, and saving's a lot harder than it was even 5 years ago. My in-laws, they help at a food pantry. Anglicare, you know, brings vehicles down, like food vans, every fortnight, and people can get a whole lot of groceries for like a small amount of money, or it's free. I don't know, one or the other. It's wonderful. And they've seen a big demographic change. It's changed the people that they've seen coming through. Housing is astronomical. I am so beyond thankful that I married someone who had saved money to provide a home for us, because I think if we got married now and we were 10 years younger, I would just think, well, I guess you just rent forever, and that's what it is, right? Like, people are really struggling, and I think the coalition sees that. Labor, I think Labor does too. Like, people know that that middle Australia, that's what John Howard likes to call them, is struggling. But it does change in what do we do about it. So we're going to read a little more in that ABC article. This is still from the coalition. It says, our emission reduction goals will never come at the expense of Australian families, and this is the principle that will guide every decision that we take. I think this is a really wise position, because John Anderson has been someone that's done a really good job on his podcast of having many guests come on and discuss what is net zero costing us. And it's costing us everything. Like, the budget is crazy, and people are spending money. Even I had someone knock on our door offering us a battery, and right after I'd finished kind of writing the outline for this episode, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't think it's good economic policy. Like, there's these subsidies on these batteries, but what if we let the people who are rich and really believe that electric vehicles and batteries and solar, that's one way that they can live a bit off grid and alleviate the burden on everyone else. Awesome for them. And that's typically what happens. The richer people get, we'll talk about this in a minute, the more thoughtful they are about how they spend their money. Because it's not just about having enough, you can really think about where is the value in terms of a whole different realm of areas, right? Value in different places. And that's what people will do. But should my taxes be going to help, you know, old Bob next door get a battery? How much money would we save if we didn't do that? I reckon a lot. Now, again, I just want to be clear. I do really think that the Bible teaches that we are supposed to honor the earth that God made, to use it to our advantage, but also to take care of it. But do you know what? Like, people aren't even having kids because of climate anxiety. And we are literally sacrificing our human population to the earth's flourishing rather than using it for our own. That is much more extreme than mining for coal or storing nuclear waste. I remember Veronica Milsom. She used to be on Triple J, and then, I don't know, I think she went and did her own thing. But she did this podcast after her second kid called Zero Waste Baby, which was actually great, and I super recommend it. I found it really interesting as a mom with kids a similar age, and I also think she made a lot of really good points about environmental responsibility. But even she has limited the amount of kids that she's going to have because of the environmental impact, which I think is insane. And it shows what we've done, how our priorities have gone askew, how now, instead of honoring God and using the creation he's given us responsibly as good stewards, that instead we have done two things. We have made the government God and given them the glory for saving us and saving the world. And we've made the world God, right, by, again, sacrificing our own children at the altar of environmentalism. not our own children, our own humanity, the human race. We've sacrificed the human race on the altar of environmentalism if people aren't going to have children because of environmental impact. Now, in the book of Matthew, in the Bible, Jesus gets asked, what are the two greatest commandments? And what does he say, right? He says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, is to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I don't think this is that toxic thing of like, oh, I need to love myself enough so that I can love others. It's this idea that in the same way that we're striving for our own survival and to take care of our own needs, that we're willing to extend that to others. That we're willing to say to everybody, you are made in the image of God, and I will fight to protect your rights as a human, and I will love you and fight for you in the same way I would for myself. But now these policies of labor and the Greens are not loving our neighbor. They remove God from his creation, and they elevate the climate activists above everyone else. And now I get that at this point you might just say, Rayne, come on, you grew up on the oil fields. You're just a climate denier. Prove what you're saying. Okay, I'm going to try. Now, again, I want to let you know, like, I am not an expert. I am here hoping to give you tools to be able to think about things. I'm not here to tell you what to think, but hopefully encourage you more on how to think. But I'm doing my best to be wise and to be a good steward of what God has given me, because he's given me so much. He's given all of us so much. So I'm not here trying to just poke holes for the sake of a political agenda, but I'm trying to think, how do we love God and love our neighbor as best as we can so that we can live lives that are fully glorifying to God? So here is my best. So CSIRO says that Australia is responsible for about 1% of global emissions. That's a number I've heard a lot. I think it's about the same for Canada. Another source I had read, which was Climate Analytics, said that we're responsible for 4.5% of global fossil CO2 emissions. I'm not sure if that's different or if it's just a more specific wording, but whatever. If we just like go, CSIRO is government, take that as you will. But if we say so between 1 and 4%. But the people that are at the 4.5%, they say that is well exceeding our population and our economic output. So basically it's just too much. But that number is still worth considering. So if we take we'll just go with the 1% and not to try to play it down, but just because that's the number I've heard the most. CSIRO, I think, is a trustworthy source. And when I see Climate Analytics, it makes me think they're going to inflate the number as big as they can. But I'm just saying, don't read into the fact that I'm taking the 1%, but it's just what I'm going to do. We can do 2% if you want, that's fine. But the number is worth considering. So even if Australia is the 14th biggest emitter of the CO2, 1% is 1%. So if you just killed everyone in Australia right now and we had zero emissions, it literally wouldn't make a difference to what's happening in regards of human impact worldwide. That's really sobering. It literally wouldn't matter. Now, other countries are a little bit different, right? The US produces approximately 12.6 to 13.5% of global carbon dioxide emissions based on recent data. China produces 30% of global carbon emissions. No surprise there. I think they're opening a new coal-fired plant something like every week. It's something crazy like that. India produces approximately 7 to 8% of emissions, but the thing is with all of those countries, they're not stopping. But the problem is that in a country like Australia, I think what has happened is that people aren't using the world to honor each other and to honor God, but they are using the world not to subdue even, but to subjugate people. They've not only put the earth theologically in the place of God, but they've put themselves in the place of God as well. They are honored, the climate activists are honored for saving the world the way that we should honor God for creating it. And that's a problem. And so if theologically, I really do believe we're supposed to be environmentally conscious and responsible. But if Australia isn't really making that big of an impact anyways. What does actually make a difference, right? Like Jordan Peterson, if you ever listen to him, love the guy. Sometimes he carries on more than he should let his guests talk more. But anyways, big fan. He grew up where I grew up, sort of like same province, very similar context. But he spends an extraordinary amount of time explaining that when people get richer, like I was saying before, is that they're more thoughtful about how they spend their money because they can afford to. Just like how middle-class families like mine aren't stretching the budget as far as it can go to buy a Tesla, but many rich people are, right? And if they want to buy batteries and do that on their own dime, then I think that's a great choice for them if they think that that's actually what's going to be helpful for the environment and the people around them. But it's really interesting to think about these things because, like, say this time last year, we were getting ready for an election in Canada, and Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader of the opposition in Canada, who actually now, funny, represents my home constituency, he was on Jordan Peterson's podcast about this time last year in the lead up to the election, and he was talking about exactly this. He said they could turn off Canada and it would make no difference at all. It would just, things would keep going. China, the US, India, they would all keep doing what they're doing. But say they made a deal with India to replace all of their dirty, bad, worst of the Russian coal with Canadian natural gas, of which there is plenty, it would actually make a really huge difference to emissions. And the other thing is that when you give people access to power, and cheap power at that, and reliable power that is much cleaner, it gives people more opportunity because they have access to cheap power, and it gives them more opportunities to be entrepreneurial, and it actually rises people out of poverty. And then once they make more money, then they can be more conscious of how they get their power, what are the best sources, how do they spend their money, and they become more environmentally conscious. It's just what happens. So in that scenario that Poilievre lined up, that Canada has this deal to give a whole lot of natural gas to get rid of all the really dirty coal in India, in that scenario we would be, I think, more loving to our Indian neighbors, where people are honestly still dying from breathing in the fumes because they might still be burning dung to cook their food in slums. Like, that is gross. And we're saying natural gas is worse? Definitely not. Right? So we would be more loving towards our Indian neighbors. We would too be using what we have access to make humanity flourish. It would positively impact the Canadian economy, and it would also probably impact the Indian economy better because they would have more access to cheap power options. They would get richer and be more thoughtful about how they spend their money. Now, I think that thinking through some of these things shows us that it's a more nuanced issue than the climate activists have wanted us to know, right? The other thing that Jordan Peterson spends a lot of breath talking about is how semi-arid areas in the world are greener now than ever before because plants need CO2, right? There's places that weren't quite deserts, but were desert-ish, and now they're green. Plants need CO2, and we need plants. We need oxygen, right? It's also worth noting, I don't know quite as much about this, but we rely on fossil fuels or coal for solar panel production, and a lot of that also happens out of China. And I don't know about you, but I would prefer us not to be really super reliant on China, even though I know we are. So that's also worth considering. But no hate, by the way. Like I said, it was a big life goal to get solar panels, and now we finally have them. And while I'm like, oh, is that the best decision? Our power bills have been less because we're really conscious to use them in the day. We're the people that are like, run the dishwasher in the middle of the day while the sun's out so it's free. Like, we would not use our aircon at all if we didn't have solar panels. But anyways, no hate on the panels, but it is worth knowing that we need to use, dirtier forms of electricity in order to source the glass for them. We also know that there's not really a good way, it seems, to recycle the parts for like wind farms, like the massive blades. Like, we don't know what to do with them when they reach the end of their lives. So again, we need to be considerate in the choices that we make. But I really honestly believe that it's more of a heart issue. Like, are we being greedy and exploitive? Or are we trying to be good stewards who are figuring out what do we do with what God's given us? Do we want to be good stewards of God's creation? Do we want our fellow man to flourish? Are we so full of empathy for the earth that we are blinded to the plight that net zero policies are inflicting on our populations? Those are the questions that I want you to ask. These are the questions that we need to be asking. So I want to end with Labor's response to what the coalition has done. I bet that you can guess already what it is. So again, this is from the same ABC article, which I'll link below as well. You know, I read it most to you. Climate Council's chief executive, Amanda Mackenzie, warned that the decision would lead to more natural disasters and higher power bills. After a decade of denial, distraction, and delay, the coalition still doesn't get it. You can't win elections by ignoring the voters who want meaningful climate action, she said in a statement. I like this bit. If the coalition keeps undermining the environment and the economy, then they're heading for net zero seats. They're clever. You gotta give them that. But my response to their response is, well, where's my $275 of power savings, Chris Bowen? You know, he said every Australian would save $275 if Labor got in. As far as I'm aware, that hasn't happened. I'm sure it would be all over everything if it did. And I think Labor is under some kind of delusion that they are being compassionate when really they're letting the average Australian down. You might disagree with me here. That's okay. Like, I do really believe that Labor thinks they're being compassionate, and there is a credit for that, right? Like, we don't want to misrepresent people or say they're not that they're just flippantly trying to destroy the common man. So you might disagree with me, and that's okay. But I think the coalition has done a really good thing here. Now, why have they done it? Oh, it's hard to know. Maybe it's because they're in touch with the pulse on the ground, right? That people are really struggling and net zero isn't quite what we've been sold in the past 15 years. Maybe it is because they think this is something, a stand they can take without it being too much. Like, they're not going to come out and say, we're not aborting babies anymore. Like, they're not going to come out at this point and say that we really need to protect women against trans ideology. Like, they're not at the point where they're going to do that. But maybe this is the first thing where they think, well, we're still stepping forward, which I agree with. Like, I think reducing emissions, trying to cause less damage to our environment is the right thing. And they're just saying we don't have to put a time frame on it. That we should be trying to do better as a rich country, but without disadvantaging the people in our community. And I think that's actually really reasonable. Now, I really recommend that you guys listen to John Anderson's podcast. For Australian interviews on these kinds of topics, he's undoubtedly the best, and it's the biggest podcast in this kind of environment, in the Australian podcast space. And another interesting source is an American chick. Her name is Lucy Biggers. So she was actually a climate activist and has changed her mind. And she'd worked for big media corporations in New York and was on the pro-climate change side of things. But she's changed her mind, and her Instagram's awesome because she spends an amount of time trying to focus on reducing climate anxiety, which I think is really fun. And she also did an interview with Ali Stuckey that I'll link below. I don't think she's a Christian. I didn't get that vibe when I watched her on Ali Stuckey. It was a little while ago, a few months. But I do think it's a good resource. And again, I'm not trying to be the definitive speaker on any of these things. And maybe if there's a Christian out there who wants to talk about it, if maybe you're someone who's really into the climate policy and thinks that net zero is absolutely what we should be doing, maybe we can talk about you coming on and we can speak more about these things. I'm really trying to be open-minded and not just like really stubborn in what I think for the sake of it. But again, I'm really trying to glorify God. So anyways, I hope that you enjoyed the second episode of the Rayne Orange Show. That's all that we have time for today.